On the night before his execution, America's most infamous killer sat alone inside a concrete cell, while thousands gathered outside demanding justice. Inside Florida State Prison, guards whispered nervously, because even after years behind bars, Ted Bundy still frightened everyone around him. Reporters flooded nearby highways before sunrise, chasing rumors that Bundy's final hours were becoming stranger and far more disturbing than expected. Behind steel doors and fluorescent lights, prison. Staff carefully documented every movement, every sentence, and every unsettling smile Bundy displayed during isolation. But almost nobody outside those prison walls understood the psychological collapse, quietly unfolding during the final 48 hours before his execution began. For years, Bundy maintained the image of an intelligent and charming law student, hiding unimaginable violence beneath calm conversations and calculated confidence. Investigators eventually connected him to brutal murders across multiple states, transforming his name into one of America's most terrifying criminal symbols. Even after conviction, Bundy continued manipulating interviews, courtrooms, and media appearances, creating dangerous fascination across the entire United States public. By January 1989, his final appeals were collapsing rapidly, while prison officials prepared the electric chair known ominously as Old Sparky. Outside the prison gates, crowds sold souvenirs and celebratory shirts, turning the scheduled execution into a grim national spectacle watched around the world. Inside death row, however, the atmosphere felt completely different, heavy with tension, silence, and growing uncertainty surrounding Bundy's unusual behavior. Guards later admitted many officers avoided eye contact because Bundy remained unnervingly calm while discussing ordinary topics just hours before execution. During meals and security checks, Bundy reportedly joked with staff members, creating an atmosphere so uncomfortable that some guards struggled sleeping afterward. Meanwhile, lawyers desperately pushed emergency appeals through federal courts, hoping one final delay could stop the execution scheduled before dawn arrived. Deep inside his narrow prison cell, Bundy spent hours writing letters, while television crews gathered outside under powerful floodlights and rising anticipation. Witnesses later described hearing distant cheering beyond the prison walls, reminding everyone that, the entire country was waiting for a historic ending. But behind that national obsession existed another terrifying reality, because investigators still believe Bundy concealed unknown secrets about additional victims. Detectives continued questioning him during his final days, hoping fear of death might finally force honest confessions from the notorious serial killer. As execution day approached closer, Bundy suddenly began revealing shocking details investigators had never publicly connected to several unsolved murder cases. Then, during one late-night conversation inside death row, Bundy made a disturbing statement that completely changed the emotional atmosphere inside the prison. Bundy quietly told investigators that violence had consumed him for years, but many detectives still questioned whether his sudden honesty was completely genuine. Every confession seemed carefully controlled, revealing enough horrifying information to delay execution while still hiding parts of the truth. Investigators desperately wanted. Inside interrogation rooms near death row, exhausted detectives listened carefully because each new detail potentially connected Bundy to previously unidentified murder victims. The closer execution moved, the more prison officials noticed dramatic changes in Bundy's behavior, shifting unpredictably between calm charm and visible panic. Guards reported moments where Bundy paced aggressively across his tiny cell, muttering quietly before suddenly stopping whenever footsteps approached the corridor outside. During one interview, Bundy allegedly became emotional while describing certain victims, creating confusion among investigators who never trusted his manipulative personality. Yet many experts later believed those emotional reactions were not remorse, but fear of losing control as death finally became unavoidable and immediate. Outside Florida State Prison, media helicopters circled continuously through the night while television anchors described every possible development to fascinated national audiences. Protesters and survivors gathered near barricades carrying signs, photographs, and candles, waiting through darkness for the execution everyone knew was approaching rapidly. Some celebrated openly outside the prison gates, while others remained deeply disturbed that such public excitement surrounded an event involving human death. Inside death row, prison workers tested execution procedures repeatedly, checking electrical systems carefully because any mistake could create horrifying consequences before witnesses. The electric chair itself stood waiting inside a stark execution chamber, illuminated by harsh lighting that intensified the terrifying atmosphere surrounding the process. Bundy's attorneys continued making desperate phone calls through the night, searching for judges willing to consider emergency constitutional arguments against the execution order. But as midnight passed, federal courts rejected appeal. After appeal, slowly destroying Bundy's remaining hope that another delay might still save his life. Prison witnesses later recalled hearing long periods of silence from Bundy's cell after those legal failures finally reached him during the early morning. Then suddenly, Bundy requested additional meetings with investigators, offering more confessions only hours before his scheduled execution inside Florida State Prison. Detectives rushed back into the prison immediately, believing Bundy might finally reveal the locations of victims families had searched for during painful decades. During those final interviews, Bundy described murder scenes with chilling precision, forcing investigators to confront details too disturbing for public release afterward. Some officers later admitted the conversations affected them permanently because Bundy spoke calmly about horrific violence as though discussing ordinary daily experiences. But before sunrise arrived, one final development inside death sent unexpected tension through the prison and changed the execution schedule completely. Just hours before execution, prison officials received notice that another emergency appeal had reached the United States Supreme Court for immediate review. Inside death row, tension spread instantly because nobody knew whether Bundy's execution would proceed or face another last-minute legal postponement before dawn. Guards prepared for both possibilities while reporters outside broadcast non-stop updates, fueling nationwide suspense surrounding one of America's most infamous criminal cases. Bundy appeared cautiously hopeful after hearing the news, speaking more confidently while attorneys waited anxiously beside constantly ringing prison telephones throughout the night. But shortly after midnight, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal completely, removing the final legal barrier protecting Bundy from execution inside Florida State Prison. Witnesses later described a dramatic, emotional shift after the decision, as reality finally settled over death row with terrifying and irreversible certainty. Prison guards reported that Bundy became unusually quiet afterward, sitting motionless for extended periods beneath cold fluorescent lights inside his isolated concrete cell. Nearby officers monitored him continuously because officials feared possible self-harm attempts before the scheduled execution could legally take place at sunrise. Around 2 o'clock that morning, Bundy met privately with a spiritual advisor who prayed beside him inside the heavily guarded prison corridor. The conversation remained confidential, but witnesses noticed Bundy appeared emotionally exhausted afterward, unlike the composed public image he maintained throughout previous years. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, massive crowds continued growing larger as vendors sold food, drinks, and anti-Bundy merchandise beneath television floodlights. Some people celebrated openly as though attending a sporting event, creating an atmosphere many observers later described as deeply unsettling and morally disturbing. Survivors and victims' families, however, stood silently nearby, carrying emotional scars connected forever to the crimes that shocked the entire United States. Inside the prison kitchen, officials prepared Bundy's final meal while execution staff reviewed strict procedures designed to prevent complications during the electrocution process. Bundy reportedly ate very little that night, spending most remaining hours speaking quietly with attorneys and occasionally reviewing handwritten legal documents inside his cell. As dawn approached closer, prison administrators conducted final security checks across every corridor connected to the execution chamber and witness observation rooms. Reporters waited outside through freezing darkness because everyone understood the pod. Next few hours would become one of America's most watched criminal justice events. Then prison officials informed Bundy that no additional appeals remained and the execution would proceed exactly as scheduled after sunrise arrived. Witnesses later recalled that Bundy stared silently toward the floor for several seconds before finally nodding slowly without speaking another word afterward. And while the prison prepared for execution morning, Bundy made one final request that deeply unsettled several guards standing outside his death row cell. Bundy requested additional time with investigators, insisting he still possessed critical information about murders authorities had never successfully solved across multiple states. Detectives entered death row once again before sunrise, hoping the fear of imminent execution might finally break Bundy's decades of manipulation and secrecy. During those final conversations, Bundy described violent patterns investigators believed matched several unsolved disappearances stretching far beyond previously confirmed victim counts. Yet many detectives sensed Bundy still withheld important truths deliberately, maintaining psychological control even while sitting only hours away from execution. Inside the prison corridor, guards noticed growing anxiety among staff members assigned directly to the execution chamber that morning, before sunrise finally arrived. Some officers later admitted they dreaded witnessing Bundy's final moments because the entire case carried an unusually dark psychological weight throughout the prison. As morning light slowly emerged outside, prison officials began escorting approved witnesses through secure checkpoints toward the heavily guarded execution observation area. Journalists, attorneys, investigators, and victims' relatives quietly entered the witness room while thick silence settled across Florida State Prison before dawn fully appeared. Inside his cell, Bundy changed into prison-issued clothing and received final instructions regarding the execution procedure he would soon face publicly before witnesses. Witnesses later described Bundy appearing physically exhausted, yet strangely alert, as though desperately trying to maintain composure against overwhelming fear and inevitability. At approximately 7 o'clock, guards entered the cell and informed Bundy that preparations for transfer to the execution chamber would now officially begin. According to prison staff, Bundy's face changed immediately after hearing those words, revealing visible fear that many officers had never previously witnessed before. The notorious calmness that defined Bundy for years suddenly appeared fragile as guards secured restraints and escorted him slowly through death row corridors. Prison workers stood silently aside while Bundy passed, creating an atmosphere several witnesses later compared to witnessing history move directly toward unavoidable tragedy. Outside the prison gates, crowds erupted loudly after rumors spread that Bundy was finally being transferred toward the execution chamber inside the prison complex. Television cameras captured cheering spectators celebrating openly while anti-death penalty. Protesters nearby condemned the growing carnival atmosphere surrounding the scheduled execution event. Inside the execution chamber, Old Sparky waited beneath harsh lighting, its leather restraints prepared carefully moments before Bundy entered the heavily secured room. Witnesses later recalled hearing only footsteps and distant electrical equipment while guards positioned Bundy. He sat beside the infamous chair that ended multiple executions previously. As officials secured restraints around his body, Bundy scanned the witness room quietly, appearing noticeably calmer than moments earlier during the prison transfer. Then, only seconds before the execution process officially began, Ted Bundy delivered his final public statement inside Florida State Prison. Looking toward witnesses and prison officials, Ted Bundy thanked his attorneys and family members calmly before speaking his final words aloud inside the chamber. Bundy stated that he wanted his loved ones to continue supporting one another, ending the brief statement without directly mentioning the victims of his crimes. Many witnesses later described the moment as deeply unsettling because Bundy's voice sounded controlled, measured, and strangely ordinary beneath the execution chamber lights. After the statement ended, prison staff secured electrodes carefully to Bundy's body while officials completed final procedural checks required before the execution commenced officially. Silence consumed the chamber as witnesses watched prison personnel step backward slowly, leaving Bundy restrained completely inside the wooden electric chair known as Old Sparky. At exactly 7:16 that morning, executioners activated the electrical current flowing through the chair as witnesses stared through reinforced observation glass silently. Several witnesses later reported seeing Bundy's body tense violently during the first surge of electricity before smoke briefly rose inside the execution chamber. Prison doctors examined Bundy immediately afterward while officials prepared a second patron, electrical cycle to ensure the execution met Florida's required legal standards completely. Minutes later, doctors officially pronounced Ted Bundy dead, ending one of the most infamous serial murder cases in modern American criminal history forever. Outside Florida State Prison, enormous crowds erupted into celebration. After news spread that Bundy's execution had finally been completed shortly after sunrise that morning, some spectators cheered loudly while others cried emotionally, reflecting the complicated national reaction surrounding the death of America's most notorious serial killer. Yet despite the execution, many investigators believed Bundy carried countless unanswered secrets to his grave, including possible unidentified victims never officially discovered afterward. Detectives continued reviewing Bundy's final confessions for years because several statements appeared connected to disappearances authorities still could not completely explain publicly. Survivors and victims' families, however, faced a different reality because no execution could erase the trauma left behind by Bundy's years of violence. Psychologists later studied Bundy extensively, trying to understand how intelligence, charm, and manipulation concealed such extreme brutality beneath an ordinary public appearance. The case transformed American criminal profiling permanently, influencing how investigators approach serial murder investigations across the United States during the following decades afterward. Even decades later, recordings from Bundy's final interviews continued disturbing investigators because of his calm tone while discussing horrifying acts of calculated violence. Inside Florida State Prison, several guards later admitted the execution remained unforgettable, describing the atmosphere as psychologically heavy long after Bundy's death ended. Ted Bundy's final 48 hours exposed something far darker than one execution, revealing how evil can hide convincingly behind confidence, intelligence, and charm. And somewhere within those final death row conversations, investigators still believe Ted Bundy left behind secrets the world may never fully uncover.